Welcome to Snoozing History. Tonight we're travelling back to one of history's strangest years. A year when summer never came, when snow fell in June, when crops froze in their fields, and the sun seemed to dim behind a veil of perpetual twilight. The year was 1816. Across Europe, America, and Asia, people woke to an impossible reality. Their calendars said summer, but their windows showed winter. And no one knew why. So how could a volcano on the other side of the world freeze an entire summer? How did humanity survive? And what did this strange year teach us about our fragile climate? Before we begin, if these stories help you in any way, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. And let me know in the comments. Do you come here mainly because you love history, or to help you fall asleep? Now let's journey back to 1816. To the year without summer. To understand what happened in 1816, we need to travel back 1 year earlier, to a mountain most people had never heard of. Mount Tambora sits on the island of Sumbawa in what's now Indonesia. Picture it, if you can. A perfect volcanic cone rising over 14,000 feet into the tropical sky, its slopes covered in dense jungle, its peak often wreathed in clouds. Before April 1815, it had been quiet for so long that no living person remembered it ever erupting. The local communities had no reason to fear it. They farmed its fertile volcanic soil, built their villages in its shadow, and lived their lives as their ancestors had for generations. The mountain was simply part of the landscape, as permanent and reliable as the earth itself. Then in early April, the mountain began to speak. Small earthquakes trembled through the region. The ground itself felt uncertain underfoot. Smoke rose from the crater, first in thin wisps, then in darker, more ominous columns. These were warning signs, but what could anyone do? There was nowhere to go, no way to outrun what was coming. On the evening of April 10th, 1815, Mount Tambora exploded with a force that defies easy description. Imagine standing 100 miles away and hearing what sounds like artillery fire. Imagine windows rattling in their frames from a blast originating beyond the horizon. Imagine the sky itself splitting open. The sound of the eruption was heard nearly 2,000 miles away. In Sumatra, people thought they heard distant naval battles. In Java, the Dutch colonial authorities sent ships to investigate what they assumed were cannon blasts from a vessel in distress. The explosion was so violent that it removed over 4,000 feet from the mountain's height in a matter of hours. The top of Tambora, that perfect volcanic cone that had stood for millennia, simply ceased to exist. The eruption killed tens of thousands of people instantly. Entire villages vanished as if they had never been. Pyroclastic flows, those superheated avalanches of gas and rock that move faster than any human could ever run, swept down the mountainsides. They moved at hundreds of miles per hour, incinerating everything in their path. When they reached the sea, they didn't stop. They continued across the water, creating walls of steam. Tsunamis radiated outward from these impacts, striking distant coasts with waves that swept away entire communities. The immediate devastation was almost biblical in scale, but that was just the beginning. The true impact of Tambora wouldn't be felt for months, and when it came, it would reach across the entire planet. You see, the eruption didn't just destroy what was immediately around it, it launched something else into the sky, something invisible, something that would linger far longer than the ash and smoke. Mount Tambora threw an estimated 100 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. That's a number so large it becomes almost meaningless. So think of it this way. If you took all that material and spread it across the United States, it would bury the entire country under several inches of debris. But most of this material didn't fall back to Earth right away. The most powerful eruptions, the true monsters like Tambora, send their payload high into the stratosphere, that layer of atmosphere that sits miles above where weather happens, above where rain forms and winds blow. And once material reaches the stratosphere, it can stay there for years, circling the globe on high-altitude winds that most of us will never feel. The volcanic ash, the heavier particles of pulverized rock and glass, they fell back to Earth within weeks or months. Ships sailing through the waters around Indonesia reported ash falling on their decks like black snow. The ash formed rafts on the ocean surface, floating masses of pumice that ships had to navigate around. But the sulfur dioxide, that was different. That was patient. In the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide combines with water vapor through a series of chemical reactions to create something new, tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. Each droplet is almost invisible, smaller than a particle of dust. But when there are trillions upon trillions of them, when they spread across thousands of miles of atmosphere, they form a veil, a thin, persistent haze that looks almost like nothing. And this veil has a peculiar property that would change the world. It reflects sunlight, not all of it, but enough. Just a few % of the sun's energy bounced back into space before it can warm the earth below. Through the summer and fall of 1815, this volcanic veil spread across the northern hemisphere. It drifted on stratospheric winds, moving slowly but inexorably, wrapping itself around the planet like an invisible shroud. It was so high up, so thin, that most people didn't even notice it. If you had looked up during the day, the sky might have seemed slightly hazier than usual, perhaps. The stars at night might have seemed a touch dimmer, but nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. The sunsets, though, the sunsets were different. They took on unusual colours, brilliant oranges and deep reds and purples that seemed almost unnatural. Artists noticed. Poets remarked on the strange beauty of the twilight. In London, in Paris, in New York, people gathered to watch the sun go down, in shades they had never quite seen before. But no one understood what they were seeing. No one connected these atmospheric oddities to a volcano that had erupted half a world away on an island most people couldn't find on a map. How could they? The science didn't exist yet. The very idea that an eruption in the East Indies could affect the weather in Europe or America would have seemed absurd. The connection between volcanic eruptions and global climate was completely unknown. As winter 1815 turned to spring 1816, the veil remained, still invisible to most, still unrecognized, but present nonetheless, high above the earth, quietly reflecting away a small but significant fraction of the sun's warmth. And that's when people began to notice that something was very, very wrong. Spring is supposed to be a time of renewal. The earth warms. Snow melts into streams that run full and cold through awakening valleys. Farmers prepare their fields, turning soil that releases the rich, earthy smell of ground ready for planting. Seeds go into that soil with hope and expectation. It's a rhythm that humans have followed for thousands of years, a reliable pattern that civilizations are built upon. Our entire agricultural system, our ability to feed ourselves, depends on this rhythm. Winter, spring, summer, autumn, cold, warm, hot, cool. The seasons turn, and we turn with them. But in 1816, spring didn't come. Not really. In New England, farmers waited for the ground to thaw. They watched the thermometer, checked the sky, tested the soil with their hands. Still frozen, still hard. They waited for the frosts to end, for that reliable stretch of days where the temperature stayed above freezing and plants could be trusted to the earth. They waited, and winter simply wouldn't release its grip. March was cold. That wasn't entirely unusual. March in New England can be capricious, can throw one last storm before yielding to spring, but April remained frigid. Rivers that should have been flowing ran sluggish with ice. The air stayed sharp and cold, biting at exposed skin. That was concerning. Farmers began to worry. Their planting window was narrowing. Then May arrived, and snow still fell. That was unprecedented. You have to imagine what this meant to a farming family. Picture yourself standing at your window on a May morning. You should be looking at green fields beginning to emerge, early flowers blooming, trees budding out. Instead, you're watching snowfall. Heavy, wet snow that accumulates on ground that should be soft and ready for planting. Your family's survival depends on what you can grow. There are no grocery stores to fall back on. No supply chain delivering food from warmer climates. What you grow is what you eat. And if you can't plant, you can't grow. And if you can't grow, come winter, you starve. The psychological weight of watching that May snow must have been crushing. In Europe, from Britain across the continent to Russia, the pattern was the same. Farmers grew anxious. They consulted almanacs that promised spring by certain dates that came and went without warmth. They talked to their neighbours, to travellers from other regions, trying to understand if this cold was local or widespread. Old men consulted their memories and their fathers' memories, reaching back through generations. Had there ever been a spring this cold? Some recalled difficult years, certainly. The old ones always remember hard times. But nothing quite like this. Nothing where winter simply refused to yield. Where the cold stretched on week after week with no break, no warmth, no hope. The thing is, weather is variable, always has been. People in the early 19th century were accustomed to cold snaps and late frosts. They knew that nature could be unpredictable. A late freeze could damage crops, certainly, but it was part of farming, part of life. Risk was built into the system. So while 1816's spring was strange, unsettling even, most people assumed it was just that. Strange weather, an anomaly, a run of bad luck that would correct itself. Next month would be better, next week would surely bring warmth. They watched the sky and prayed for sun. They performed whatever rituals their culture suggested might influence the weather. And slowly, reluctantly, with growing desperation, they began planting their crops into cold, unwelcoming soil, hoping that summer would make up for spring's absence. Summer would surely arrive. Summer always arrived. It was June after all, and June meant warmth. June meant growth. June meant hope. Except that year, it didn't. June is the heart of summer in the northern hemisphere. School children should be running through fields. Flowers should be in full bloom, filling the air with their perfume. The days should be long and warm and full of life. Those endless summer days where the sun barely seems to set, where light stretches late into the evening. Instead, on June 6th, 1816, snow fell across New England. Not a light dusting that would melt by mid-morning. Not a brief flurry that people could laugh about. That unusual moment to tell stories about in years to come. Heavy snow, accumulating snow. The kind of snow that belongs in January, not June. Summer snow. Farmers woke that morning to a world transformed. They emerged from their houses into air that bit and stung. They saw their newly planted fields. Those fields they had worked so hard to prepare despite the cold, buried under white. In Vermont, the snow accumulated 6 inches deep. In New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, in upstate New York, people stared in disbelief at a landscape that looked like December, not June. Trees that had finally, tentatively, begun to leaf out were bent under the weight of snow. The tender young leaves, so recently emerged, froze and blackened. Birds that had migrated north for the summer seemed confused, disoriented, as if they had arrived in the wrong season entirely. Imagine that for a moment. You've spent weeks preparing your fields. Your back aches from the work. Your hands are calloused from the plough. You've planted your crops even though the ground was too cold. Even though every instinct told you it was too early. Because if you waited any longer, there wouldn't be time for them to mature before autumn. You're depending on these crops for survival. Your family will eat what you grow, or you'll go hungry. There's no alternative. There's no backup plan. Your harvest is everything. It's life itself. And then you wake up one morning in June, in what should be the warmth of early summer, and your fields are covered in snow. The tender shoots you had coaxed from the frozen ground are dead, killed by ice in June. The psychological impact of that must have been staggering. It wasn't just the loss of the crops, though, that was devastating enough. It was the breaking of the world's promise. The seasons had failed. The natural order had collapsed. If summer itself could be cancelled, what else might fail? What other certainties might prove false? But it wasn't just New England. Across the Atlantic, Europe was experiencing its own agricultural nightmare. Killing frosts continued through June and July, months when frost should be impossible, when the earth should be warm and generous. Crops that had managed to sprout despite the cold spring were cut down by ice. In Britain, in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, farmers watched their livelihoods wither and die. The wheat turned brown instead of golden. The stalk stood thin and weak, unable to produce proper grain. The oats never matured. Potatoes, usually one of the more reliable crops, rotted in the cold, wet soil. The ground was too cold for the tubers to form properly, and constant rain created perfect conditions for blight. This wasn't a regional problem. Some local weather pattern gone wrong. This was hemisphere-wide. From Canada to northern Italy, from Ireland to Poland, the same story played out with only minor variations. Summer had been cancelled. The calendar said June, July, August, but the weather said winter, and the weather won. The strange thing was how the cold manifested. It wasn't a steady, brutal freeze, the kind you could at least prepare for, plan around. Instead, temperatures would swing wildly, unpredictably. A few warm days would give hope. Farmers would think maybe the worst had passed. Maybe normal summer had finally arrived. They would work frantically to plant again, to try to salvage something from the season. And then overnight, without warning, frost would strike. The tender new growth would blacken and die. It happened again and again, this cycle of hope and devastation. It was exhausting. It was maddening. It was as if the atmosphere itself couldn't decide what season it was supposed to be, as if the world was caught between winter and summer, unable to commit to either. The scientific explanation, had anyone known it then, was that the volcanic veil was creating atmospheric instability. The weakened sunlight couldn't establish normal summer weather patterns. The jet stream, that river of high-altitude wind that usually flows in predictable patterns, became erratic. Cold air from the polar regions kept pushing south, bringing Arctic conditions to temperate zones. But the people living through it had no explanation. They had no framework for understanding what was happening. They only knew that the world had become unreliable in the most terrifying way possible. The one thing they had always been able to count on, the turn of the seasons, had failed them. Throughout that surreal summer, people tried to adapt. In New England, farmers replanted multiple times, refusing to give up hope even as each crop succumbed to frost. Some tried to protect their plants, covering them at night with whatever they had. Blankets, cloth, straw, building small fires in their fields, staying up all night tending flames, trying to create pockets of warmth in a world that had turned inexplicably cold. It was exhausting, often futile work. Children helped, carrying water, gathering wood, doing whatever they could. Everyone understood what was at stake. This wasn't about money or comfort. This was about survival. The growing season that had begun late was now being cut short. By August, when the first autumn frosts would normally arrive and wouldn't matter because crops would already be mature and ready for harvest, it barely made a difference. There was little left to freeze. The crops had already failed. The sunsets that summer were extraordinary, though few people had the luxury to appreciate them. Artists across Europe and America noticed them and tried to capture them in paint. The British painter J.M.W. Turner created some of his most dramatic works during this period. If you've ever seen his paintings, you'll know them. Paintings filled with strange, intense colours, skies that seem to burn with unnatural fire, deep oranges that shade into blood reds, purples that seem almost electric, colours that look exaggerated until you realise he was documenting what he actually saw. He wasn't inventing these colours. He wasn't taking artistic license. He was painting reality. The volcanic aerosols in the upper atmosphere were scattering light in unusual ways, creating atmospheric optics that had never been seen before in living memory. Light hitting those billions of tiny sulfuric acid droplets would refract and scatter, creating colours that seemed to belong to dreams rather than daily life. Beauty and disaster, it turned out, could coexist. The same atmospheric veil that was starving millions created sunsets of unprecedented beauty. Nature, as always, was complicated. As summer ended and autumn began, the true scale of the crisis became impossible to deny. The harvest, what little there was of it, fell catastrophically short across the northern hemisphere. Grain supplies dropped to perhaps half of what was needed in some regions. In others, the failure was nearly total. Fields that should have been golden with wheat stood brown and barren. Corn that should have grown tall and full produced only stunted stalks with tiny, underdeveloped ears. And in the early 19th century, this wasn't an inconvenience. This wasn't a matter of having less variety at the market or paying slightly more. This was existential. Most people, especially in Europe, spent the majority of their income on food. 70–80% of everything they earned went to feeding themselves and their families. When food prices doubled or tripled, as they did throughout 1816 and into 1817, families faced impossible choices. Feed everyone inadequately and watch them weaken, or feed some people enough and let others go hungry. There were no good options, only terrible ones and slightly less terrible ones. In Europe, the crisis hit harder than in America, though America certainly suffered. Europe was more densely populated, more dependent on imports and trade, more vulnerable to any disruption in food supply. By late 1816, food riots broke out across the continent. In France, in Germany, in Switzerland, desperate crowds attacked grain stores, bakeries and markets. These weren't criminals or revolutionaries. These were ordinary people, families, farmers and workers and merchants, driven to desperation by hunger. Governments tried to respond, but what could they do? You can't legislate crops into existence. You can't pass a law that makes wheat grow. Some nations banned the export of grain, trying to hoard what little they had for their own populations. This helped locally, perhaps, but made the crisis worse elsewhere. It was every nation for itself, and within nations, it was often every community for itself, every family for itself. The social bonds that hold civilizations together began to fray under the strain of hunger. The winter of 1816–17 was brutal, and not just because of temperature. It was brutal because people entered it already weakened, already depleted. They had spent their savings trying to buy food at inflated prices. They had eaten through their reserves. And now winter had arrived, that time of year, when even in good times food was scarce, and survival was hardest. Malnutrition spread through populations that were already vulnerable, and where malnutrition spreads, disease follows. Typhus outbreaks swept through Europe. Typhus thrives in conditions of poverty, crowding, and weakened immune systems. It found all three in abundance. The disease killed thousands, and the deaths were recorded in parish registers as typhus, but the root cause was hunger. The root cause was that frozen summer. In Ireland, already suffering from poor governance, exploitative landlords, and economic policies designed to extract wealth rather than sustain populations, the crop failure was devastating. Tens of thousands died. It was a preview, a terrible foreshadowing of the more famous potato famine that would come 3 decades later. But this earlier crisis has been largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by later disasters. The people who died in Ireland in 1816 and 17 died just as surely as those who would die in the 1840s, but their deaths have been forgotten, lost in the larger narrative of history. Migration became a survival strategy, one of the few options left for people who had lost everything. In New England, thousands of farm families gave up. They looked at their frozen fields, their failed crops, their empty barns, and they made the hardest decision of their lives. They would leave. They would abandon the land their families might have worked for generations and move west. If the East Coast climate had become unreliable, if even the seasons couldn't be trusted anymore, perhaps the frontier offered better chances. Perhaps in Ohio, in Indiana, In Illinois, the weather might be more predictable. It was a gamble. Most had no idea what they would find. They had heard stories, rumours, tales of fertile land and opportunity, but they were moving into uncertainty. Still, staying meant certain starvation. At least moving offered hope. In Europe, migration was more difficult. Borders were more rigid. Opportunities more limited. Political restrictions more severe. But still, people moved. From the countryside to cities, thinking that perhaps in urban areas there might be work, might be food. From poor regions to slightly less poor regions, following rumours of places where the harvest hadn't completely failed. Some emigrated, leaving Europe entirely for America, believing the stories of land and opportunity in the New World. 1816 and 17 saw a surge in emigration, people fleeing not just poverty, but a climate that seemed to have turned against them. And yet, in the midst of all this suffering, something unexpected happened. Something that reminds us that human creativity can flourish even in the darkest times, perhaps especially in the darkest times. On the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a group of writers found themselves trapped indoors by the cold, wet summer. They had come for a pleasant holiday. Lord Byron, already famous as a poet, rented the Villa Diodati. His personal physician, John Polidori, accompanied him. Nearby, Percy Bysshe Shelley rented a smaller house with his lover, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont. They had expected sunshine and mountain views. They had expected to spend their days sailing on the lake, hiking in the Alps, enjoying the Swiss summer. Instead, they spent most of their time confined inside by the relentless rain and cold. The weather was miserable, day after day of grey skies, of rain, of temperatures that felt more like autumn than summer. They couldn't go out. They couldn't enjoy the landscape. They were stuck indoors in a foreign country, waiting for weather that never improved. Bored and restless and searching for something to do, Byron proposed a challenge. Each of them would write a ghost story. It was just a game, a way to pass the time, an attempt to create entertainment in a summer that had failed to deliver any natural pleasures. Mary Godwin, not yet 19 years old, struggled with the assignment at first. She listened to the others discuss their ideas. Byron started something. Polidori worked on a tale that would eventually become The Vampire, one of the first vampire stories in English literature. But Mary couldn't think of anything. She wanted to write something meaningful, something that would stand up to the literary talents surrounding her. Days passed. She listened to conversations. She thought about the nature of life and death, about science and creation. And then one night, after an evening of discussing galvanism and the experiments of scientists who had used electricity to make corpses twitch and move, she had a nightmare. She dreamed of a scientist, a man who had discovered the secret of creating life. In her dream, she saw him kneeling beside a creature he had assembled from dead tissue. She saw this creature awaken, saw the moment when the scientist realized what he had done, the horror of creation. When she woke, she began to write. The story poured out of her, the story of Victor Frankenstein and his creature, his monster, the story of a man who overreached, who tried to become like God, and who paid a terrible price for his hubris. Without the year without summer, without that cold, dark, oppressive weather that kept them all trapped inside with nothing to do but tell stories, Frankenstein might never have been written. One of the foundational works of science fiction, one of literature's great explorations of the consequences of human ambition, was born from boredom and bad weather. Climate and culture, it turns out, are deeply intertwined in ways we rarely consider. Byron, too, was inspired by the darkness of that summer. He wrote a poem called Darkness, a bleak, apocalyptic vision of a world where the sun has gone out, where humanity slowly dies in the cold and dark. I had a dream, which was not all a dream, it begins. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. Reading those lines now, knowing what Byron was experiencing, it's difficult not to see the influence of that sunless summer. The reality they were living through, the dimmed sun filtering through volcanic haze, the perpetual gloom, the sense that the world had fundamentally broken, all of it poured into Byron's verse. Art mirrors life, and life in 1816 was dark indeed. As 1817 arrived, there was cautious, fragile hope. Surely people thought this couldn't happen again. Surely the weather would have returned to normal. Whatever had caused the previous year's catastrophe had to be temporary. Nature would correct itself. The seasons would resume their proper order. And slowly, tentatively, they did. The spring of 1817 was still cooler than usual, still wetter than ideal, but it was recognisably spring. The ground thawed. Seeds went into soil that stayed warm enough for them to germinate. Summer arrived, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. You can imagine the relief people must have felt when June arrived and stayed warm, when July brought heat instead of frost, when crops actually grew and ripened and didn't die overnight. The sun felt stronger, the sky seemed clearer, the world slowly and imperfectly was healing itself. Harvests in 1817, while not abundant, were adequate. Food prices began to fall from their crisis peaks. The riots subsided. Markets functioned again. Bread became affordable again. People who had been surviving on the edge of starvation could eat properly. Children who had grown thin and weak began to regain strength. Life began to return to something approaching normal. The immediate crisis was over. The nightmare had ended. But the recovery was slow and uneven and painful. Many families had exhausted their savings during the crisis years. Many farmers had lost their land, unable to pay the debts they had incurred trying to survive. The economic and social scars of the year without summer lasted for years, for some for decades, and the memory lingered. For generations afterward, it was known simply as 1800 and froze to death in New England. In Europe, it was the year without summer, or the poverty year. It became a reference point, a marker of hardship against which other difficult years were measured. Grandparents would tell their grandchildren about the year it snowed in June, about the summer that never came, and the children would listen with wide eyes, unable to quite believe that such a thing had really happened. The strangest thing about the whole crisis, though, the most unsettling aspect of it, was that no one knew what had caused it. People understood that the weather had been abnormal. That much was obvious. But why? What had caused this massive, hemisphere-wide disruption? Various theories circulated, as they always do when people are confronted with inexplicable events. Some blamed sunspots. Astronomers had observed unusual solar activity, and perhaps people thought the sun itself was weakening. Perhaps the sun was going out. It was terrifying to consider, but it seemed to fit the evidence. Others thought it was divine punishment for human sin, that God was expressing displeasure with humanity's wickedness. This had historical precedent. The Bible itself spoke of plagues and famines as divine judgment. A few scientifically minded individuals suggested that Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity had disturbed the atmosphere, had upset some natural balance. Franklin had died in 1790, but his experiments with lightning and electricity were well known, and perhaps, some theorized, those experiments had set in motion changes that took decades to manifest. All of these theories were wrong, completely, entirely wrong, but they were the best people could do with the scientific knowledge of the time. The true cause, the eruption of Mount Tambora halfway around the world, wasn't connected to the global cooling until much, much later. How could it be? No one in Europe or America even knew that Tambora had erupted. News travelled slowly in 1815. A volcanic eruption in the Dutch East Indies might be noted in colonial records, but it would take months for that information to reach Europe, and even then it would be filed away as a local disaster. Nothing more. No one had any reason to think that an eruption in Indonesia could affect the weather in Switzerland or Vermont. The idea was absurd on its face. The world was big. Distances mattered. How could something that happened on the other side of the planet affect your local weather? It seemed impossible. It took decades for scientists to piece together what had happened. Through the 1830s and 40s, researchers began to study the relationship between volcanic eruptions and climate more systematically. They noticed patterns. Major eruptions seemed to be followed by cooler years. The data wasn't perfect, the correlation wasn't always clear, but there seemed to be something there. Slowly, painstakingly, the mechanism became clear. Volcanic eruptions inject material into the atmosphere. Some of that material stays up there for years. And that material, those tiny droplets of sulfuric acid formed from volcanic sulfur dioxide, reflects sunlight. Less sunlight reaching the Earth means cooler temperatures. It's simple physics, really, once you understand it. But understanding it took time and careful observation and the development of new scientific tools and methods. By the late 19th century, the connection between Tambora and 1816 was firmly established. Scientists could look at the historical record, at the timing of the eruption and the timing of the cooling, and see the clear link. What had been a mystery, an act of seemingly random divine or natural caprice, was revealed to be a predictable physical phenomenon. The world wasn't breaking. It wasn't being punished. It was responding to a massive atmospheric disruption in exactly the way that physics dictated it should. There was order in the chaos. There were rules, natural laws, that governed these events. And once you understood the rules, you could potentially predict future events. You could prepare. This understanding fundamentally changed how we think about climate. Before the year without summer and its eventual explanation, climate was thought to be essentially stable over human timescales. Yes, there were seasons. Yes, there were good years and bad years. But the overall climate was constant, unchanging, subject only to divine will, or perhaps very long-term astronomical cycles measured in thousands or millions of years. The year without summer proved that climate could change dramatically in a very short time, that it could shift in a matter of months from normal to catastrophic, that these changes could have global consequences affecting millions of people. It was one of the first clear, undeniable examples of how interconnected our planet's systems are, of how what happens in one place doesn't stay in one place. The atmosphere is a single, planetary system. Disturb it in Indonesia, and farmers in Vermont watch their crops freeze. Disturb it anywhere, and the effects ripple across the entire globe. Today, we monitor volcanoes carefully, perhaps obsessively. We have satellites that track eruption plumes in real time, measuring their height and composition. We can watch volcanic ash and gas rise into the stratosphere and spread across hemispheres. We have models that predict how major eruptions will affect global temperatures, how long the cooling will last, which regions will be most affected. We know that a Tambora-scale eruption would still cause significant disruption. Crops would still fail in some regions, food prices would still spike, there would still be suffering, but we wouldn't be caught completely unaware. We'd know what was happening and why. We'd have time to prepare, to adjust agricultural practices, to move food stores, to implement disaster response plans. It wouldn't be easy, but it wouldn't be the mystery it was in 1816. And that knowledge, that understanding, makes all the difference. The year without summer also taught us something important about human resilience. Yes, tens of thousands died. Yes, there was suffering on a vast scale, hunger and disease and displacement and despair. But humanity survived. People adapted. They migrated when staying meant death. They changed their farming practices. They helped each other when they could, sharing what little they had. Governments, however imperfect their responses, tried to help. And when it was over, when the atmospheric veil finally cleared and the sun returned to full strength, people rebuilt. They planted again. They had children. They continued. They didn't give up. We're here, after all, descended from people who made it through 1816 and countless other crises. Survival is in our bones. Adaptation is in our DNA. There's something oddly comforting in that long view of history. The world has been disrupted before, profoundly, catastrophically disrupted, and yet life continued. Civilization continued. Not unchanged, certainly. Every crisis leaves its mark, shapes the future in ways both obvious and subtle, but continued nonetheless. The world will be disrupted again. Climate, we now know, is not a stable backdrop to human history, but an active participant in it. A force that shapes empires and topples civilizations, that creates conditions for flourishing and throws obstacles in our path. Sometimes it's generous. Sometimes it tests us. 1816 was one of those tests, a harsh one. And humanity, for all its flaws, all its suffering and cruelty and short-sightedness, passed. We're still here. The frozen summer is also a reminder of how dependent we are on systems we don't fully control. The farmers of 1816 couldn't change the weather. They couldn't clear the volcanic veil from the stratosphere. All they could do was respond to conditions as they found them, adapt as best they could, and hope. We're not so different today, despite our technology and knowledge. Yes, we can predict better. Yes, we can prepare more effectively. But we're still fundamentally dependent on the stability of planetary systems that we influence, but don't control. The atmosphere, the oceans, the climate, the great cycles of nature. These are things we live within, not above. We affect them, certainly. We're affecting them now, but we don't control them. We're part of the natural world, subject to its laws and its whims, dependent on its stability for our survival. Perhaps that's why the story of 1816 still resonates with us, still feels relevant even more than 2 centuries later. It reminds us of our place in the world, not separate from nature, not masters of it, but part of it, subject to it, affected by it in ways we can't always predict or prevent. A volcano erupts on the other side of the world, and farmers in New England watch their June crops freeze. The connections aren't always obvious. The cause and effect can be separated by vast distances and long stretches of time. But the connections are always there. The planet is smaller than we often think, more interconnected, more fragile, and yet also more resilient, more capable of recovery than we sometimes give it credit for. As you drift off tonight, consider the paradox of that frozen summer, a year of hardship that produced Frankenstein, one of literature's great works, a crisis that killed thousands, but also forced innovations in agriculture, in food distribution, in disaster response. A mystery that, once solved, helped launch the modern science of climatology, helped us understand our planet and our relationship to it. History is complicated that way. Causes and effects ripple outward in ways we can't always predict or even imagine. Sometimes the connections only become clear decades or centuries later, when we have the distance to see patterns invisible to those living through events. The people who lived through 1816 couldn't know that they were experiencing a volcanic winter. They couldn't know that the strange, dim sun and the perpetual cold were caused by aerosols from a mountain most of them had never heard of, in a place they couldn't find on a map. All they knew was that summer had abandoned them, that the world had become unreliable, that survival required everything they had. And yet they endured, they survived. They passed down their stories, their memories of the year summer forgot to come. And those stories, kept alive through generations, eventually helped scientists understand what had happened. Human memory and human curiosity, working together across centuries, solved a planetary mystery. So as you rest, let yourself feel connected to that long chain of human experience, to the farmers who watched their crops freeze in June and planted again anyway, to the artists who painted those strange, beautiful sunsets, to Mary Shelley, 19 years old, creating a monster in a cold Swiss villa while rain drummed on the roof, to the scientists who, decades later, pieced together the puzzle of tambora and atmospheric cooling, to all the people who survived and adapted and continued, who passed their stories down to us. You're part of that same human story, that same long struggle to understand our world and our place in it, to survive whatever nature throws at us and somehow keep going. The year without summer eventually ended. The veil cleared, the sun returned to full strength. Life went on as it always does, and so it continues, year after year, century after century. The world changes, challenges come, some predictable, some sudden and shocking, and humanity, somehow, finds a way forward. Not always gracefully, not always fairly, not without loss and suffering and sacrifice, but forward nonetheless. That's what we do. That's what we've always done. We endure, sleep well. And when you wake, summer will still be there, waiting. The seasons still turn in their ancient patterns. The sun still rises each morning. And we carry on, as we always have, as we always will, through whatever the world brings. Good night.